28th of June, 1918. The guns fell silent across the Western Front, but the echoes of their thunder would reverberate for decades to come. In a railway carriage in the forest of Compiègne, German representatives sat humiliated, their hands trembling as they signed the armistice that would end the Great War. Outside, French Marshal Ferdinand Foch watched with cold satisfaction, knowing that this moment would mark not an end, but a beginning. The war had devoured a generation. 10 million soldiers lay dead in muddy graves from Verdun to the Somme. Empires that had stood for centuries, the Habsburgs, the Ottomans, the Romanovs, the Hohenzollerns, crumbled into dust. Yet in the corridors of Versailles, where the victorious powers gathered to reshape the world, few understood that they were lighting a fuse that would ignite an even greater catastrophe. Woodrow Wilson, the American president, with his idealistic 14 points, arrived in Europe believing he could forge a lasting peace. He envisioned a world of self-determination, where nations would settle disputes through a League of Nations rather than battlefields. But David Lloyd George of Britain and Georges Clemenceau of France had other priorities. They had lost too many sons, spent too much treasure, and suffered too much devastation to show mercy to their defeated enemy. The Treaty of Versailles, signed on the 28th of June, 1919, exactly 5 years after the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand that had sparked the Great War, became a document of revenge disguised as justice. Germany was stripped of 13% of its European territory, including the industrial heartland of Alsace-Lorraine and the coal-rich Saar Basin. Its overseas colonies were distributed among the victors like spoils of war. The German military was reduced to a token force of 100,000 men, forbidden from possessing tanks, aircraft, or submarines. But the most poisonous clause was Article 231, the War Guilt Clause. It placed sole responsibility for the war on Germany and its allies, demanding reparations that would eventually total 132 billion gold marks. A sum so astronomical that Germany would be paying it into the 21st century. According to historical analyses published in The Economic Consequences of the Peace by John Maynard Keynes in 1920, these reparations would cripple the German economy and breed resentment for generations. In Berlin, the news of the treaty's terms sparked riots and despair. The German people, who had been told by their own propaganda that they were winning the war until the sudden collapse, felt betrayed. Right-wing nationalists spread the Dalsche the stab-in-the-back myth, claiming that Germany had not been defeated militarily, but betrayed by socialists, communists, and Jews on the home front.
Ow.
This poisonous lie would find fertile ground in the chaos of the Weimar Republic. The new German democracy was born into crisis. The Kaiser had fled to exile in the Netherlands, leaving a power vacuum filled by competing factions. Communist revolutionaries attempted to seize control in Berlin and Munich, inspired by the Bolshevik success in Russia. Right-wing paramilitary groups called Freikorps, composed of bitter war veterans, violently suppressed these uprisings. In this atmosphere of political violence and economic instability, extremism flourished while moderate voices were drowned out. Few recognized then what historians would later understand. Versailles had not ended the war, but merely declared an armistice in a conflict that would resume with even greater ferocity 2 decades later. 11th of January, 1923. French and Belgian troops marched into the Ruhr Valley, Germany's industrial powerhouse, claiming Germany had defaulted on its timber and coal deliveries as part of the reparations payments. The occupation was legal under the treaty, but its consequences would prove catastrophic. German workers responded with passive resistance, refusing to operate the mines and factories. The government in Berlin supported them, continuing to pay their wages even as production ground to halt. To finance this resistance, the Weimar government simply printed more money. The result was hyperinflation on a scale the world had never witnessed. Prices doubled every few days. A loaf of bread that cost 250 marks in January cost 200 billion marks by November. Life savings evaporated overnight. Middle-class families, who had lived comfortably for generations, found themselves destitute. Wheelbarrows full of banknotes couldn't buy a cup of coffee. People burned money for warmth because it was cheaper than coal. The hyperinflation destroyed the social fabric of German society. Those who had worked hard, saved responsibly, and believed in traditional values saw their world collapse. Meanwhile, speculators and those with access to foreign currency prospered. The sense of injustice and betrayal deepened. According to economic historians referenced in William L. Shire's The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, this period fundamentally undermined faith in democratic institutions and created a population desperate for strong leadership and simple solutions to complex problems. In Munich, a failed artist and war veteran named Adolf Hitler had found his calling. He had joined a small group called the German Workers' Party in 1919, quickly becoming its most effective speaker. His speeches, delivered with hypnotic intensity in beer halls across Munich, blamed Germany's suffering on the November criminals who had signed the armistice, the vindictive allies who had imposed Versailles, and an international Jewish conspiracy he claimed controlled world finance. On the 8th and 9th of November, 1923, Hitler attempted to seize power in what became known as the Beer Hall Putsch. The coup was a fiasco. 16 Nazis and 4 police officers died in a brief shootout in central Munich. Hitler was arrested, tried for treason, and sentenced to 5 years in Landsberg prison, though he would serve only 9 months. Many dismissed him as a failed rabble-rouser whose moment had passed. But in prison, Hitler wrote Mein Kampf, my struggler-rambling manifesto that laid out his worldview with chilling clarity. He advocated for the destruction of the Treaty of Versailles, the unification of all German-speaking peoples, the conquest of Lebensraum, living space in Eastern Europe, and the elimination of Jewish influence from German life. Few who skimmed the book's tedious pages in the 1920s imagined that within a decade, its author would have the power to implement these nightmarish visions. The crisis of 1923 marked the nadir of the Weimar Republic's early years. Yet, paradoxically, it also led to stabilization. Gustav Stresemann, serving briefly as chancellor and then as foreign minister, introduced a new currency backed by land and mortgages, the Rentenmark, that halted the inflation. He negotiated the Dawes Plan, which restructured Germany's reparation payments and brought American investment flooding into the German economy. The French withdrew from the Ruhr. Between 1924 and 1929, Germany experienced relative prosperity and cultural flowering. Berlin became the artistic capital of Europe, famous for its theater, cinema, and nightlife. The Nazi Party's membership declined. Hitler's apocalyptic warnings seemed increasingly irrelevant in a country that was rebuilding and moving forward. Democracy appeared to be taking root, but this golden era rested on a foundation of American loans. When Wall Street crashed on Black Tuesday, the 29th of October, 1929, those loans dried up instantly. The worldwide economic depression that followed would prove the Weimar Republic's death sentence and give Hitler the crisis he needed to seize power. 14th of September 1930. Berliners woke to shocking news that would reverberate through German politics like an earthquake. In the Reichstag elections, the Nazi Party had surged from 12 seats to 107, becoming the second largest party in parliament. The Communists had also gained, reaching 77 seats. The moderate center parties that supported democracy had collapsed. Germany's political landscape had been transformed overnight. The Great Depression had struck Germany with particular ferocity. By 1932, 6 million Germans were unemployed, nearly 1 in 3 workers. Long queues formed outside soup kitchens. Homeless veterans slept in parks and train stations. Young men who had never known anything but economic crisis joined political movements offering radical solutions. Street battles between Nazi brown shirts and communist Red Front fighters turned German cities into war zones. Chancellor Heinrich Brüning, a fiscal conservative from the Catholic Center Party, responded to the crisis with exactly the wrong policies. Determined to prove Germany's creditworthiness and end reparations, he imposed brutal austerity measures. Cutting government spending and raising taxes during the worst possible time, unemployment benefits were slashed. Public sector wages were reduced, the economy spiraled deeper into depression, and with it, support for extremist parties grew. Hitler had learned from his failed putsch. He would come to power legally, using democratic procedures to destroy democracy from within. He crisscrossed Germany in aircraft, bringing his message to dozens of cities in carefully choreographed mass rallies. Nazi propaganda, masterminded by Joseph Goebbels, was sophisticated and effective. They promised jobs for workers, security for the middle class, glory for veterans, and a return to greatness for the nation. Different audiences heard different messages, all delivered with fanatical conviction. The conservative establishment, particularly the aristocratic and industrial elites who wielded real power in Germany, made a catastrophic miscalculation. They despised the Nazis' vulgarity and violence, but believed they could use Hitler's popular support for their own purposes. They thought they could control him, channel his energy, and discard him when convenient. Former Chancellor Franz von Papen famously remarked that they would hire Hitler and within 2 months have pushed him so far into a corner that he'll squeak. On the 30th of January 1933, President Paul von Hindenburg, the 85-year-old war hero who represented the old Prussian military establishment, appointed Adolf Hitler as Chancellor of Germany. The Nazis celebrated with torchlight parades through Berlin that night. Thousands of brown shirts marched in formation, their torches casting flickering shadows as they sang party anthems. It was a scene from a nightmare, but most Germans still didn't realize what had been unleashed. Hitler moved with breathtaking speed to consolidate absolute power. On the 27th of February 1933, the Reichstag building burned in mysterious circumstances. Hitler immediately blamed communist conspirators and persuaded Hindenburg to sign an emergency decree suspending civil liberties. The Reichstag fire decree, referenced in contemporary newspaper accounts from the New York Times, abolished freedom of speech, press, and assembly, and allowed indefinite detention without trial. It remained in effect until Germany's defeat in 1945. In March, elections held under conditions of systematic intimidation, with Nazi stormtroopers stationed at polling places, the Nazis won 44% of the vote. Combined with their conservative nationalist allies, Hitler had a majority. On the 23rd of March, the Reichstag passed the Enabling Act, which allowed Hitler to enact laws without parliamentary approval. Only the Social Democrats voted against it. The Communists had already been arrested or driven underground. Democracy had voted itself out of existence. Within months, Germany became a one-party dictatorship. Independent trade unions were dissolved, opposition parties were banned, books were burned, Jews were systematically excluded from professional life, and concentration camps opened to house political prisoners. The transformation was so rapid that many Germans struggled to comprehend what was happening until it was too late to resist. 3rd of October, 1935, Italian forces under the command of Marshal Pietro Badoglio crossed into Ethiopia from Italian Somaliland, beginning a war of conquest that would test the resolve of the international community. Benito Mussolini, Italy's fascist dictator, had long coveted this African nation, one of only 2 independent countries on the continent, to avenge Italy's humiliating defeat at the Battle of Adwa in 1896 and build a new Roman Empire. The invasion was brutal. Italian aircraft dropped poison gas on Ethiopian troops and civilians alike. Modern tanks and artillery overwhelmed Emperor Haile Selassie's poorly equipped forces, though Ethiopian resistance was fierce and prolonged. The emperor traveled to Geneva to appeal personally to the League of Nations, delivering a prophetic warning that would haunt the assembled delegates. It is us today, will be you tomorrow. The League of Nations, the international body created after the Great War to prevent exactly this kind of aggression, proved utterly impotent. Member states condemned Italy and imposed economic sanctions, but these excluded the 2 resources Italy needed most, toil and steel. Britain and France, the League's most powerful members, feared driving Mussolini into alliance with Hitler, and therefore ensured the sanctions were toothless. The message was clear: international law would not be enforced when it conflicted with the perceived interests of great powers. Hitler watched this failure with keen interest. In March 1936, emboldened by the world's passivity toward Italian aggression, he ordered German troops into the Rhineland, the demilitarized buffer zone between Germany and France established by Versailles. It was an enormous gamble. The German military was still weak, and Hitler had ordered his generals to retreat immediately if French forces responded, but France did nothing. Britain, viewing the Rhineland as Germany's backyard, saw no reason to risk war over Germans marching into their own territory. German generals who had opposed the move as too risky were stunned by this success. Hitler's prestige soared. He had torn up another provision of the hated Versailles Treaty without firing a shot. From this moment, his confidence in his own strategic genius, in his contempt for the Western democracy's weakness, would shape his increasingly aggressive foreign policy. As documented in William L. Shire's Berlin Diary, Hitler privately told his associates that he knew at that moment that the Western powers would not fight to uphold the treaty. The Western democracy's failure to act stemmed from multiple causes. France was politically paralyzed by a divided government and unwilling to act without British support. Britain was still traumatized by the Great War's carnage and desperate to avoid another conflict. British public opinion, influenced by widespread guilt about the harshness of Versailles, sympathized with German grievances. Many British conservatives viewed Nazi Germany as a bulwark against communist expansion from the Soviet Union. Moreover, both Britain and France were militarily unprepared for war in the mid-1930s. Years of neglect had left their armed forces obsolete and underfunded. Rearming would require massive expenditures that depression-weakened economies could ill afford. Political leaders convinced themselves that Hitler's ambitions were limited once Germany recovered the territories lost at Versailles and unified German-speaking peoples. Surely he would be satisfied. This policy of appeasement, most associated with British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, rested on a fundamental misunderstanding of Hitler's goals. Western leaders assumed he was a traditional nationalist, seeking to revise an unjust treaty. They failed to grasp that his aims were revolutionary and unlimited the domination of Europe. The destruction of Jewish Bolshevism and the enslavement of inferior races to create living space for Germanic peoples. These goals were laid out explicitly in Mein Kampf, but few Western leaders bothered to read it seriously. In Spain, a dress rehearsal for the coming World War was unfolding. When civil war erupted in July 1936, after Francisco Franco's military rebellion against the elected Republican government, Hitler and Mussolini sent troops and weapons to support Franco's nationalists. The Soviet Union provided limited aid to the Republicans. Britain and France adopted a policy of non-intervention, effectively abandoning Spanish democracy. German and Italian forces gained valuable combat experience testing new weapons and tactics that would soon be used on a larger stage. 12th of March, 1938. German tanks rolled across the Austrian border in the early morning hours, encountering no resistance. Austrian Nazi sympathizers had spent weeks creating chaos, and the government in Vienna had collapsed under pressure. Chancellor Kurt Schuschnigg, who had desperately tried to maintain Austrian independence, was arrested. Adolf Hitler, returning to his birthland in triumph, wept with emotion as crowds lined the streets of Linz and Vienna to welcome the Anschluss, union of Austria with Germany. The annexation of Austria violated the Treaty of Versailles explicitly, which had forbidden union between Germany and Austria. It also demonstrated Hitler's increasingly confident contempt for international law. He had absorbed a nation of nearly 7 million people and gained control of Austria's gold reserves and industrial capacity without firing a shot. Britain and France issued formal protests but took no action. Czechoslovakia, surrounded on three sides by Greater Germany, suddenly looked dangerously vulnerable. That spring, Hitler turned his attention to the Sudetenland, the border regions of Czechoslovakia where 3 million ethnic Germans lived. Nazi propaganda depicted these Germans as an oppressed minority suffering under Czech rule, though in reality, Czechoslovakia was the only functioning democracy in Central Europe, and its minorities enjoyed more rights than in most neighboring countries. Hitler demanded that the Sudetenland be transferred to Germany, threatening war if his demands were rejected. Czechoslovakia had defensive alliances with France and the Soviet Union. Its army was well-trained and modern, its border fortifications formidable. Czech President Edvard Beneš prepared to fight, confident that France would honor its treaty obligations. But the French government, terrified of another war, looked to Britain for leadership. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain believed that war could be avoided through negotiation and that Hitler's demands, however unpleasant, were fundamentally reasonable. In September 1938, Chamberlain flew to Germany 3 times for personal meetings with Hitler, the first time a British prime minister had traveled by aircraft for diplomatic negotiations. Hitler escalated his demands with each meeting, sensing Chamberlain's desperation for peace. Finally, Chamberlain French Premier Édouard Daladier Hitler Mussolini met in Munich on the 29th and 30th of September. Czechoslovakia was not invited to attend discussions about its own dismemberment. The Munich Agreement handed the Sudetenland to Germany. Chamberlain returned to London declaring he had achieved peace for our time, waving the agreement signed by Hitler as proof that the German leader could be trusted. Crowds cheered him rapturously, relieved that war had been averted. Only a few voices, most notably Winston Churchill, warned that Britain had suffered a total defeat. Churchill told Parliament, "You were given the choice between war and dishonor. You chose dishonor, and you will have war. The Munich Agreement destroyed Czechoslovakia's ability to defend itself. The Sudetenland contained its border fortifications and much of its industry. Stripped of these defenses, the country was at Hitler's mercy. Moreover, Poland and Hungary, emboldened by the great powers' betrayal of their Czech ally, seized additional Czech territory for themselves. The international order based on collective security and treaty obligations had collapsed entirely. On the 15th of March 1939, German forces occupied what remained of Czechoslovakia, creating a protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia and establishing a puppet state in Slovakia. This was the moment when even the most optimistic appeasers could no longer deceive themselves. Unlike Austria or the Sudetenland, the Czech lands contained no German population. Hitler had revealed that his ambitions extended far beyond uniting German-speaking peoples. His word given at Munich just 6 months earlier was worthless. Britain and France, finally awakening to reality, issued guarantees to Poland, promising to declare war if German attacked. These guarantees were militarily meaningless. Neither country could actually defend Poland against Germany, but they represented a political commitment that would force them to act when Hitler struck next. The policy of appeasement was dead, killed by Hitler's contempt for those who had tried to satisfy him. According to historical analyses published in The Origins of the Second World War by J.P. Taylor, the tragedy of appeasement was that it combined the worst of all approaches. It gave Hitler everything he wanted without winning his gratitude or trust. Strengthened Germany militarily while Britain and France remained weak, and demoralized potential allies in Eastern Europe who concluded that the Western democracies were unreliable. When war finally came, it would be fought under far less favorable circumstances than if Britain and France had confronted Hitler in 1936 or 1938. The 23rd of August, 1939. In the Kremlin, Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov and German Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop signed a treaty that stunned the world. The Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact committed Germany and the Soviet Union, ideological enemies who had spent years denouncing each other in the most vitriolic terms, to peace and neutrality. Communist parties worldwide, which had spent the decade warning against fascist aggression, were ordered to justify this bewildering alliance. Many communists quit in disgust. But the public treaty was only half the story. A secret protocol, whose existence the Soviet Union would deny until 1999, divided Eastern Europe into German and Soviet spheres of influence. Poland would be partitioned between them. The Baltic states Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania would fall under Soviet control. Stalin would have a free hand in Finland and the Romanian province of Bessarabia. Hitler and Stalin, the two greatest monsters of the 20th century, had agreed to carve up Eastern Europe between them. For Stalin, the pact was a calculated gamble. He had watched with alarm as Britain and France appeased Hitler, while rebuffing Soviet proposals for a collective security agreement. Stalin suspected, not without reason, the Western powers hoped to channel German aggression eastward against the Soviet Union. Negotiations with Britain and France in the summer of 1913 had collapsed over Poland's refusal to allow Soviet troops on its territory and Western unwillingness to grant Stalin control over the Baltic states. The pact gave Stalin breathing room. He believed it would turn Hitler's aggression westward against Britain and France, allowing the capitalist powers to exhaust themselves, fighting each other while the Soviet Union built up its strength. In the short term, Stalin gained territory and time. In the long term, this cynical calculation would prove catastrophically wrong, as Germany's conquest of Western Europe would leave the Soviet Union facing the Nazi war machine alone. For Hitler, the pact solved his greatest strategic problem. He intended to attack Poland imminently, but feared Britain and France might actually fight this time, given their guarantees. If the Soviet Union remained neutral or worse, joined the Western powers, Germany would face the two-front war that had destroyed it in the Great War. The pact with Stalin ensured that when he invaded Poland, he would face only the Western democracies, and even then, those democracies would be unable to provide Poland with direct military assistance. The pact also provided Germany with access to vital Soviet raw materials: oil, grain, manganese, and other resources that would help Germany evade British naval blockade. Stalin, desperate to keep Hitler satisfied, and the pact intact, would deliver these materials punctually right up until the moment German forces crossed the Soviet border in June 1941. Soviet trains loaded with resources would still be rolling into Germany as German bombers were destroying Soviet airfields. In Western capitals, the pact caused consternation and confusion. If Germany and the Soviet Union were allied, what exactly were Britain and France preparing to fight for? The ideological clarity of democracy versus fascism was muddied. Some conservatives who had viewed Nazi Germany as a bulwark against communism now questioned whether resistance was worthwhile. The pact strengthened those voices in Britain and France who still hoped that somehow war could be avoided. In Poland, the pact was a death sentence. The Poles had rebuffed German demands to cede the port city of Danzig and grant Germany extraterritorial transit rights across the Polish corridor, the strip of territory separating East Prussia from the rest of Germany. Polish leaders, bolstered by British and French guarantees, had finally refused to compromise. They expected that if Germany attacked, the Soviet Union would remain hostile to Germany, giving Poland at least a chance of survival until Western aid arrived. Now Poland faced enemies on both sides. The Polish army, though large and brave, was poorly equipped and based its defensive strategy on Allied support that would never come. Polish cavalry, the subject of later Nazi propaganda myths, was actually an effective mobile infantry force. But no amount of courage could compensate for the fact that Poland faced the two largest armies in Europe simultaneously, while its supposed allies sat behind the Maginot Line doing nothing. Hitler set the invasion date for the 1st of September, 1939. He had attempted to manufacture a justification, ordering SS troops to stage a fake Polish attack on a German radio station. But such pretenses hardly mattered anymore. The great powers had demonstrated repeatedly that they would not enforce international law. Hitler expected that Britain and France would once again issue protests, but ultimately accept the conquest of Poland as they had accepted the annexation of Austria and Czechoslovakia. This time, he was wrong. The public mood in Britain and France had shifted decisively. There could be no more retreats, no more Munich agreements. Hitler had destroyed any credibility that his ambitions were limited or that his word could be trusted. The guarantees to Poland, however militarily meaningless, were political commitments that could not be abandoned without complete humiliation. When German forces crossed the Polish border, Britain and France would finally have to fight, beginning a war that would consume 55 million lives before it ended in 1945. 1st of September, 1939, 4:45 in the morning. The German battleship Schleswig-Holstein, anchored in Danzig harbor ostensibly on a courtesy visit, opened fire on Polish positions at Westerplatte. Simultaneously, 53 German divisions over 1.5 million men crossed the Polish border from Germany, Slovakia, and East Prussia. Luftwaffe bombers struck Polish airfields, destroying much of the Polish Air Force on the ground. The Second World War had begun. The invasion demonstrated a new form of warfare that would come to be known as Blitzkrieg Lightning War. German forces didn't advance on a broad front as armies had in the Great War. Instead, concentrated armored formations punched through Polish defenses at key points, then raced deep into Polish territory to encircle and destroy enemy forces. Dive bombers provided close air support, terrorizing troops and civilians alike. The coordination between tanks, aircraft, and motorized infantry was unprecedented. Polish forces fought bravely but were overwhelmed by German superiority in equipment, training, and tactics. The Polish plan had been to conduct a fighting withdrawal to the southeast, holding out until France launched a promised offensive from the west, but that offensive never came. French forces conducted limited probes into German territory, then withdrew behind the Maginot Line. British forces were still arriving in France and not yet ready for combat. Poland fought alone. On the 3rd of September, Britain and France declared war on Germany after their ultimatums demanding German withdrawal from Poland expired. Chamberlain addressed the British people by radio in a weary voice, stating, "This country is at war with Germany, but declaring war and actually fighting were different matters." Through the fall and winter of 1939-40, the Western Front remained quiet in what journalists dubbed the phony war, or Sitzkrieg, the sitting war. French and German troops faced each other across fortified lines but engaged in little serious combat. On the 17th of September, Soviet forces invaded Poland from the east, implementing their part of the secret protocol with Germany. Polish forces, already reeling from the German onslaught, now faced enemies on both fronts. The Polish government fled to Romania. By early October, organized resistance had ceased. Poland was partitioned between Germany and the Soviet Union for the fourth time in its tragic history. Some 200,000 Polish soldiers escaped abroad to continue fighting, but the Polish state had been erased from the map. The conquest of Poland revealed the true nature of Nazi ideology in ways that Austria and Czechoslovakia had only hinted. Systematically murdering Polish intellectuals, clergy, and nobility to decapitate Polish society. Jews were herded into ghettos in major cities, beginning a process of persecution and murder that would culminate in the Holocaust. The German goal was not merely military conquest, but the destruction of Polish culture and the enslavement or elimination of the Polish people. Stalin's actions in Soviet-occupied Poland were equally brutal. The NKVD's de-Soviet secret police deported hundreds of thousands of Poles to Siberian labor camps. In April and May 1940, on Stalin's personal orders, the NKVD murdered approximately 22,000 Polish prisoners of war, most of them reserve officers who were teachers, doctors, lawyers, and other professionals in civilian life. The Katyn massacre was designed to eliminate Poland's potential future leadership. Through the winter of 1913-40, the world waited tensely to see what would happen next. Hitler had expected to attack France immediately after conquering Poland, but bad weather and generals' reluctance caused repeated postponements. Some Western leaders hoped that the war might still be contained, that Germany, satisfied with its eastern conquests, might agree to a negotiated peace. These hopes were delusional. Hitler was already planning the offensive that would bring down France and drive Britain from the continent. In November 1939, the Soviet Union invaded Finland after the Finns refused Soviet demands for territorial concessions. The Winter War revealed shocking weaknesses in the Red Army, still recovering from Stalin's purges of its officer corps in 1937 and 38. Finnish forces inflicted enormous casualties on Soviet troops despite being vastly outnumbered. The world's sympathy lay with Finland, but no major power provided meaningful assistance. Finland eventually ceded territory but maintained its independence in, like the Baltic states, which Soviet forces would simply occupy in June 1940. The uneasy quiet on the Western Front couldn't last. German industry was producing tanks and aircraft at an accelerating rate. The Wehrmacht was training and preparing. Intelligence reports indicated that a German offensive was imminent. Yet when it finally came in May 1940, its speed and success would shock even the Germans themselves, validating Hitler's confidence in his own strategic brilliance and setting the stage for his catastrophic decision to invade the Soviet Union. 10th of May, 1940. German forces launched Fall Gel Base, Yellow-Thaw invasion of France, and the Low Countries. What happened next demonstrated conclusively that the question of what started World War II had multiple answers, revealing a different dimension of the catastrophe. Some historians point to the 28th of June 1919, when the Treaty of Versailles was signed. The treaty's punitive terms, particularly the war guilt clause and crushing reparations, created the economic chaos and burning resentment that Hitler would exploit. John Maynard Keynes had predicted in the economic consequences of the peace that the treaty would lead to another war, and events proved him tragically correct. Yet this explanation absolves Germany of responsibility and ignores that other defeated nations didn't embrace genocidal dictatorships. Others identify the 30th of January, 1933, when Hindenburg appointed Hitler as chancellor. Without Hitler personally, there would have been no World War II in the form it took. No other German leader, however nationalist or revisionist, would have pursued his apocalyptic vision of racial empire and deliberate mass murder. The war was his war, born from his ideological obsessions. Yet Hitler didn't seize power. He was handed it by conservative elites who thought they could control him. The Great Depression, beginning in October 1929, created the economic desperation that made Hitler's rise possible. In prosperous 1928, the Nazis won less than 3% of the vote. By July 1932, in the depths of the Depression, they won 37%. Economic catastrophe destroyed faith in democratic institutions and made millions desperate enough to follow a demagogue promising simple solutions to complex problems. Yet other democracies survived the Depression without succumbing to fascism. The failures of the Western democracies during the 1930s, from the League of Nations impotence over Ethiopia to the Munich Agreement's betrayal of Czechoslovakia demonstrated that aggression would not be punished. Each successful violation of international law emboldened Hitler to go further. If Britain and France had confronted Hitler militarily over the Rhineland in 1936, the war might have been prevented. Yet this perspective ignores the genuine war weariness of populations still traumatized by the Great War's carnage. The Nazi-Soviet Pact of August 23, 1939, made the invasion of Poland possible by ensuring Germany wouldn't face a two-front war. Stalin's cynical collaboration with Hitler, motivated by his own expansionist aims and distrust of the Western powers, helped unleash the conflict that would eventually cost the Soviet Union 27 million lives. Yet even this alliance might not have mattered if Britain and France had been capable of effectively defending Poland. The truth is that World War II had no single cause. It emerged from the toxic interaction of the Great War's unresolved tensions. The Great Depression's economic devastation, the triumph of totalitarian ideologies, the weaknesses of democratic institutions, the failures of collective security, and ultimately, the ambitions of leaders willing to risk everything for power and conquest. Remove any single factor, and the war might have been prevented or taken a different form. But by September 1939, all these factors had combined to make catastrophe inevitable. As German tanks broke through Allied lines at Sedan on the 13th of May 1940, beginning the conquest that would bring France to its knees in 6 weeks, the question of what started the war became academic. The relevant question was now how to survive it and what kind of world would emerge from its ashes. The 21 years between 1918 and 1939 had witnessed humanity's failure to build a lasting peace. The 6 years ahead would test whether civilization itself could survive. One might argue that World War II truly began not in September 1939 but in June 1919, when the victors of the Great War chose vengeance over reconciliation. Or perhaps it began in November 1918, when Germany signed an armistice rather than fight to total defeat, leaving Germans convinced they hadn't truly been beaten. Or maybe it was inevitable from August 1914, when the Great War's carnage destroyed the old European order beyond repair. The Second World War was, in many ways, the second half of a European civil war that began in 1914 and didn't truly end until 1945, consuming 2 generations and reshaping the entire world. The question, what really started World War II, ultimately reveals more about the historian asking it than about history itself. Those who emphasize Versailles warn against punitive peace settlements. Those who focus on Hitler argue for confronting evil early. Those who stress economic factors advocate for preventing depressions. Those who examine democratic failures call for stronger institutions. All these lessons are valid. All these causes were real. And understanding this complexity is essential to ensuring that the catastrophe that consumed 55 million lives between 1939 and 1945 is never repeated.